We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Today, I am joined by my colleague, staff editor at The Federalist, Kylie Zempel. Kylie, thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you.
So, of course, we did an emergency podcast on Saturday after the impeachment vote, and this is also really an emergency podcast, too. I mean, it's not an emergency podcast in that we always have podcasts on Mondays, but the topic, as our Federalist readers and listeners know, is really an emergency on our level and the sort of context of what we think is important here. And that would be the cancellation of Chris Harrison, the longtime host of The Bachelor. Now, this isn't an emergency because Chris Harrison's resignation from the host of The Bachelor is the end of the world. It certainly is not the end of the world, but it's important from the standpoint of setting precedents over particular behaviors and in our culture, setting cultural precedents and cultural standards. It's a show of corporate force, corporate ideological force on ABC's behalf. And it's really important, I think, for us to get to the bottom of this, because what Chris Harrison actually said is at the crux of why this is so troubling. So, Kylie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Chris Harrison actually said? I just saw that you filed a story, and one of your subheadings in it is what Chris Harrison actually said. And I think people are a little in disbelief that he was canceled over what he said. So why don't you tell us what he did, in fact, actually say?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to comment and say that Bachelor news is always an emergency, maybe not to the level of impeachment, but don't fight it, Emily. Don't fight it. So you're absolutely right that this is a big deal. And part of the reason why it's such an issue is not only is this an instance of cancel culture in the way that we've seen it in the past, but this is Chris Harrison is not being canceled for something that he specifically did or said. He is being canceled for coming to the defense of someone that the, as we term them, woke mob sometimes is trying to cancel, to just give them space to speak for themselves. Basically, what he was trying to do was pump the brakes on cancel culture. And that's what he is being canceled for. So what happened was there is a contestant on this season of The Bachelor, which, as many people know, is the first Black Bachelor in the franchise's history. So there is a contestant on this season, Rachel Kirkconnell, who had some problematic things arise from her past. Specifically, a photo of her from when she was in college in 2018. It's a photo of her dressed up at a sorority party, and the theme is the Old South. So it's an antebellum era party. And the photograph, the only thing in it is just a selfie of her and her friends dressed up at this party. And of course, people have been digging into her past, coming up with all kinds of reasons why she needs to be canceled. This photo, but also the fact that her parents are Republicans, and in the past that she has, shared posts supportive of law enforcement. She shared a post from PragerU, which apparently is a QAnon fringe website, as we all know. It's not, but
we had them on the podcast just a couple weeks ago, actually.
Which is great. So if we had Rachel on here, she would be getting canceled for being on the Federalist Radio Hour. But anyway, so Rachel had all of these things come up, and she's being grilled over them. She had yet to issue an apology or any kind of recognition of these issues at the time that Chris Harrison was called on an episode of Extra. So the host of Extra is a former Bachelorette, Rachel Lindsay. So we have two Rachels here. Don't get them confused. Rachel Lindsay was a former Bachelorette, and she was actually the first Black Bachelorette. And so she was having this interview with Chris Harrison where she was asking him to comment on the allegations against Rachel Kirkconnell. And basically, Chris Harrison's response was, look, I wasn't at this party. You weren't at this party. But I don't want to speak on behalf of Rachel. I haven't heard Rachel's comment, and we need to pump the brakes and have a little grace and compassion and recognize that, there's more at play here. Give her the space to say what she needs to say, wait until all the facts are out, and then we can have an opinion or a comment on this particular girl. And that's not something that the host wanted to hear. And in all of the recaps and the reports about this interview, they frame it only in the context of one thing that Chris Harrison said, which was that that we need to view that through the lens of 2018, and this is 2021. And so, is it wrong through just the cultural lens now, or is the photo of her at the Old South party also wrong in the context of 2018? And that's what people are really focusing on. But the 13-minute interview is basically Chris Harrison talking back to cancel culture. It's a very important interview. He says some very important things, and yet he is being canceled for talking back to cancel culture.
So, but he does it in a way that's really thoughtful and nuanced. And that to me is what is so strange about this situation, is that he's not sort of like spouting his mouth off, like a talking boomer meme about woke culture and cancel culture. He's literally calling for grace, I think, in a pretty articulate and eloquent way. And that's and by the way, he's calling for grace towards another person's errors. And so it's not even as though he's accused of doing anything himself other than asking for grace towards another person, which is not defending that person. It's I guess, perhaps defending her from irrational attacks as he sees it. But he's really just calling for grace in the situation, which is in itself kind of a concession that the person he's talking about made a mistake. And so every time I think cancel culture, and I sort of hate the term because everybody projects a million things onto it, and people who are sort of its victims are not necessarily always canceled. They're often very privileged people who can leverage their cancellations into greater success and greater publicity and fame. But in this case, we'll use the term cancel culture. Every time I think it's sort of slowing down because people in corporate C-suites at ABC, which is, the network that hosts The Bachelor, they have to know that this is coming for them, right? They have to know that they're all potentially cancelable. They have to know that this has gone too far. They have to know that there's no real public appetite for axing people like Chris Harrison, who I believe actually just resigned. That to me is what stands out about this particular case study, is that A, he's not even defending the person accused of doing something wrong. He asked for grace. And B, you have a major network like ABC involved. And I think at a time when everybody was saying like things are going to get back to normal, and that's just not happening.
It's true. So it's interesting, yes, that he is not calling for grace for himself, but for another person, which is it's really the antithesis to what we call cancel culture, because you're constantly attacking someone for doing something that you have no stake in. And here, Chris Harrison really has no stake in what happens to this girl and is still calling for grace for her, which is really important. Another thing that's interesting about Chris Harrison personally is that, we talk about people who are too big to cancel or too big to fail. And Harrison is an interesting person for this to happen to. He is a known Republican, but also is sort of a controversial figure on the right. Maybe controversial isn't the right word, but he's not some super Trumpy conservative person in the sense of being like part of the religious right or any other part of like the conservative base. I mean, he hosts this show that has some morally objectionable content. It's not like he is some staunch conservative, although he's a known Republican. And so that's interesting. It's also interesting to note that he is the only host that The Bachelor has ever had. I mean, Chris Harrison is like synonymous with the Bachelor Nation, with this franchise. So to cancel him, to knock him off, I mean, if you're ABC, what's your end game here as far as, kind of boxing Chris Harrison into a corner where he has to issue this hostage letter sounding apology and step away from the show? I mean, are you afraid? I mean, I guess it's obvious sometimes why corporate giants will cancel someone, because they think it will be good for their ratings or it will be good for them in the long term to get rid of an objectionable figure. But largely, Chris Harrison is not an objectionable figure. And how can you axe or taint the person at the top of your franchise and think that that's going to go well for you when he is synonymous with the show?
Well, yeah, and that's, again, another element of this case study that's bizarre, is Chris Harrison, as you mentioned, is the only host The Bachelor has ever had. He is iconic. He is an essential element of the show.
For nearly 2 decades. I mean, this show started in 2002. Like, this isn't a new phenomenon. He's been around for a while doing this.
Yeah, I mean, iconic is really the best word for him. And yeah, he's more subtle than some other like major pop cultural figures because he doesn't have his own huge personality and sort of like electric charisma. But that's sort of why he's been successful, is he blends into the show's dynamics and blends into the show's actions, but he doesn't, stand out in a bad way. He just stands out in a way that I think adds a little something to the programming, which is what a host is pretty much supposed to do, and sort of has stamped it with his own fingerprint. But do you get the sense that ABC was trying to move on from Chris Harrison anyway? Because sometimes that's the case with this, is the kind of woke excuse is just that. It's an excuse to get somebody out of the way that they'd been trying to get out of the way for business reasons or personal reasons. Was that the case this time around?
I mean, I think some of these corporations are so out of touch with reality that I suppose that's the case. I guess I wouldn't put it past ABC or just, ABC, I guess, to axe Chris Harrison, if only for having Republican tied to his name. But I can't imagine that it's a good business decision in any other sense, because I mean, I don't know that I would be as interested in watching The Bachelor if this iconic host were not part of it. I mean, he's part of the reason why the show is so great. We had an instance last season where there was like a little aside where one of the contestants accidentally went to Chris Harrison's suite instead of the girls' suite, and they ended up just having a glass of wine and sitting and talking. And it was such a bright spot of like, everyone loves Chris Harrison. This is a moment, this bromance. These boys are sharing this glass of wine and deep feelings, and like, because everyone loves Chris Harrison, that works. There was another instance in Claire Crawley's season where one of the men was really quite sexist to her, and Chris Harrison really held him to the fire and called him out in the Men Tell All episode in a way that was really necessary and just kind of unexpected, I guess, in that episode. And so there's different things that Harrison does, to get rid of him, you're really losing a huge flavor of the show, even though he doesn't insert himself in the way that other hosts do. And so aside from him being, somewhat conservative, I don't see another reason why it would be a strategic move, but I suppose that's probably enough these days to want to get rid of Chris Harrison.
Well, yeah, and I asked that last question as a sort of devil's advocate exercise because I doubt that that's the truth. I think everybody really does like Chris Harrison, and he really always has liked Chris Harrison. And the point that is important to acknowledge, given that he is, I assume ABC knows how essential he is to the show and how critical he's been to the show's success. People who watch The Bachelor, I imagine, like the familiarity and the routine and the sort of like predictable mechanics of the show, because that's, the show never changes. It's really always the same sort of formula. You just plug in new people and repeat. And so I assume ABC knows how essential Chris Harrison is and has been to the success of the program. And that brings us to this larger point, which is that ABC made this decision at what is presumably a high cost to them. It's a high risk to lose Chris Harrison. And this is what baffles me, is that what on earth makes it worth firing Chris Harrison over comments that were not even, he is not even the root of this problem. He was talking about another person who was the problem. So to fire or to force a resignation over Chris Harrison is sort of like mind-numbing to me, because he's not accused of doing anything other than, literally asking for grace. And that, if you're on the other side of this debate and you think that he was insensitive to ask for grace instead of asking for somebody's head, but I guess make that argument. But what is the sort of principle involved of like making him resign? What does it accomplish? Put yourself in ABC's position, put yourself in the position of somebody who's calling for him to be punished. What does his forced resignation actually accomplish?
Well, and it's very obvious that he was being forced to resign. He issued this lengthy apology on Instagram, actually 2 apologies, that sound nothing like Chris Harrison. They are nothing of the flavor. Everything that he said in his interview with Lindsay was spot on, talking back to cancel culture. You don't just flip-flop from understanding the dynamic of a woke mob coming after you and noting the fact that you're attacked from both sides. Chris Harrison is trolled online, daily. You don't go from that posture to issuing an apology that sounds nothing like you, and that's basically just groveling at the feet of this woke mob, appealing to like principles of critical race theory and anti-racism and identity culture. I mean, he's just like, it's so on his persona, on his character, that this is not an unprompted move by Chris Harrison to be like, I was wrong, I need to step away. This is very obviously proving everything that he said about cancel culture to be true. And I think it just shows the next step. Cancel culture is bad enough in and of itself, when someone who does something that's a little bit objectionable and they live their lives under the spotlight and in the public eye, when they get canceled, that's problematic in and of itself. When you have someone like Gina Carano or, fill in the blank with any number of people who've been canceled in recent days for any reason. But to have someone proving this narrative correct, that just about the problematic nature of cancel culture by talking back to it is just like, that's the next step. It's not even for something objectionable. It's for raising questions about someone being canceled for something objectionable. I mean, it's like Inception. You're like several steps removed. It's like, it's very, very messed up, but also very enlightening as far as like what principles are really at play here.
Well, yeah, I think this is key from my perspective in sort of thinking about why corporations make these decisions. And that, to me, I just think that's such an important context to have this conversation in, is that like this is corporations foisting this sort of radical cultural leftism on the rest of the country by setting norms and by setting precedents. And so ABC is a corporation. And so whomever was sitting in the boardroom at ABC, whatever executives were debating this decision, I imagine we're saying that this is a public relations nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an illusion. That's a social media illusion. This concept that woke mobs constitute an actual public relations crisis is a total illusion. It's something that people in C-suites do not understand because they exist in these bubbles. Their PR people exist in these bubbles. Their HR people exist in these bubbles. And they genuinely think that because they're getting a ton of angry tweets, which, by the way, are often coordinated and organized by online digital activists, they really think that is representative of the broader public. And on the other hand, those coordinated social media campaigns can absolutely generate headlines in some of these publications that are responsive to them. So you are going to get, a write-up in E! News, you're going to get a write-up in People, you're going to get a write-up in all of these entertainment industry publications over these controversies because they take their assignment editing cues from Twitter now, which is nonsense. So in a way, yes, it can actually present some sort of public relations problem in that you are actually having to field some of these negative headlines. But on the other hand, the broader public does not care about the content of those stories. They're not. I say this like with certainty. The broader public was not upset by what Chris Harrison said. In fact, the broader public was probably not at all concerned that a reality star had made some questionable decisions in the past. And by the way, the world has changed so quickly that I imagine when she did things like wear a Native American headdress, a lot of people were doing it. And that doesn't make it right, but it also doesn't mean that she is, a virulent white supremacist. And we sort of lose all of those distinctions in this feeding frenzy of internet backlash.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the social media point, because that's actually a point that Chris Harrison made in the interview, which is that, he was giving Rachel Kirkconnell the space to come out and talk about this photograph that had surfaced. And in doing so, he said, I'm confident that she will, make some remarks public, and reasonable people, her response will be reasonable to people who are reasonable. But he said, people on social media are not reasonable people. And that is who she'll ultimately be responding to, because those are the people that are, supposedly up in arms about her past. That's who she'll be responding to. And they're not reasonable. So anything she says is not going to appease them. It's not going to, put out this fire. It's only going to fan the flames. And it's interesting to note too, that this girl, it had been 6 weeks, I guess, since the allegations of her past had surfaced. And she hadn't said anything about them. And I think largely they had kind of just gone under the radar. I mean, I didn't hear much about Rachel Kirkconnell until I heard about Chris Harrison commenting on Rachel Kirkconnell. And if he had been able to kind of sweep this under the rug and not back down in the face of the mob then coming after him, I think we would have seen a similar result to what was happening with Rachel, where, if you don't address it, if you don't give fodder to the people coming after you, what more do they have? There's really nothing more they can say about it because the fire just kind of goes out.
Well, again, that's what's bizarre to me. I think Chris Harrison has not been like a sort of a fount of controversy in his years and years as host of The Bachelor. He's not super political in this sort of publicly facing persona. He's not super controversial. He doesn't say things that are controversial. He doesn't do things that are controversial. He's pretty much just guy next door type of dude. And that's also why he's successful on the show, because he kind of blends in. He's charming. And doesn't get in too much trouble, doesn't have too much of a presence. And so the fact that he was comfortable enough to make these very anodyne remarks about cancel culture, I think it speaks to the fact that broadly everybody has started to agree with Chris Harrison that we ought to extend a little bit of grace to people who did things in recent memory that have been sort of like, it's almost like this is kind of a victory for, say, the social justice activists who have changed our norms so quickly, right? That they've changed our norms so quickly that in just a few years' time, a co-ed would never do some of this stuff now, even if she did it a few years ago. And to not extend grace to people who acted differently when our standards were differently, I feel like most people, even in some of these elite circles, are broadly coming around to that perspective. And I think that it speaks to why Chris Harrison was comfortable enough to have this like very thoughtful and nuanced conversation. And again, it's just why this decision is so puzzling to me, because this Rachel, her alleged actions, or I guess it's not alleged, her actions went under the radar for a really long time, again, because I think people are getting sick of this stuff. And I think that's also why Chris Harrison felt comfortable enough speaking out about it. And so the fact that this ended his years-long career as the host of The Bachelor is puzzling, beyond puzzling to me.
Yeah, so I think what Chris said is where most viewers and obviously reasonable people are at. But it's also interesting to see how the rest of the franchise has responded to Chris Harrison his remarks, because during the interview, he even mentioned to Rachel Lindsay, the host, this is really great because I really enjoy our conversations. We can talk about nuanced things and have a good debate back and forth and talk about this stuff in, such a healthy way, in the way that you can't on social media, and that's all fine and good. But then the next day in a podcast, Rachel Lindsay is just tearing Chris Harrison apart and saying, the whole time he was talking, I was sitting there thinking, how could you, what the heck? And then the rest of Bachelor Nation too fed into that same impulse that Rachel Lindsay, the host, had, where they were issuing, joint statements and coming out all in solidarity against Chris Harrison, this person that, in some ways kind of made them famous. And gave them a platform, and now they're all kind of uniting against him. And obviously they're not representative. They're coming from a very particular place of privilege is not the right word, but just like this platform that's it's very Hollywood centric. It's very Instagram influencer. They're very much, they don't want to say the wrong thing because they'll get attacked for it. So of course they have to come out against Chris Harrison. But it was kind of funny that no one really came to the defense of Chris Harrison, even though I would say the majority of viewers and the majority of Americans would largely agree with him.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's outrageous that this is, again, like this all gets to the fact that he's not accused of doing anything other than asking to extend grace to somebody who arguably did something wrong years ago when standards were different. And so it's just like, it's a crazy situation. It speaks to the craziness of these times. It feels like something that would have happened over the summer and not now, because we sort of go through these swirling whirlwind cycles of heads rolling for like cancel culture offenses, and then things calm down and slow down, and like you said, her her actions kind of went unnoticed after they were initially reported for quite some time. And then it's like right when the media is bored and needs something to latch onto, they can bait any corporation. And these are corporate media outlets. They can bait any corporation into, a situation like this, a controversy like this, and the corporations take the bait. And it's just like, I don't understand from a business perspective why they still think this is smart. And I think they just like get overwhelmed by the intensity of the cultural leftist rhetoric that's sort of being flung at them en masse on social media, which is in no way representative of the broader public. And they panic and they make these stupid decisions that set cultural standards and precedents, don't they?
I think they do. And I think it's worthwhile to talk about outcomes here. So, I think after Chris Harrison gets canceled, or after he gets kind of forced to resign, the initial outcome of that is that what he said is proved to be right. It's proved to be true. He talks back to cancel culture. He gets canceled. That proves that there was some validity in what he was saying. But then you have the outcome of, he issues this apology. If he does that, and he doesn't ever come back to the show, then I think you are empowering the people who already have the power to basically end your career for anything that you say. So that's another problematic and very troubling outcome of this. But I do wonder, we talk a lot about boycotts and whether they're effective and things like that. If he steps down permanently, which I'm predicting, I could see this as a very permanent thing. I don't think this is a minor, short-lived, short-term thing. He stepped away from the show, unless there was some breaking news that came out while I was finishing that article that I just filed, which is possible. Then I don't see him coming back, whether he actually resigned or not. I don't see him coming back. In which case, like, I wonder if you'll see a big ratings drop, whether ABC will actually be punished for trying to punish Chris Harrison. And I think, like, that could be potentially the best outcome here, is just that The Bachelor ultimately fails.
Yeah, I don't think Bachelor viewers are ones to make, political statements. That's not to say there aren't some that are going to make a political statement and vote with their advertising potential and tune the show out. But I do think that it could happen by just sort of like they're going to plug in someone who's not as good as Harrison. Right. That is a really, really tricky formula. The host of a show like that seems unimportant, but that is a really tricky formula to nail. And so I could see the show just sort of devolving in quality. It's already sort of this lumbering giant that's been around for years and probably needs a little corrective energy. But I could see it sort of starting to devolve gradually with the loss of Harrison. I kind of want to talk about something this case study addresses, which was also addressed by what happened to Gina Carano, who was just on this podcast actually talking to Ben Domenech last month. She shared what could best be described as sort of like a boomer meme that compared contemporary America to Nazi Germany, in the sense that it was, the neighbors of Jewish people in Nazi Germany were the ones punishing them and dehumanizing them. And whether or not you agree with the meme and think, I don't think it's a smart decision ever to post a meme like that. But she lost her role on The Mandalorian because she shared that meme, and they'd been gunning for her for a long time because she has sort of heterodox ideas about, different cultural issues. And they used this as their excuse to axe her. Now, what's, I guess, sort of puzzling again about this is that the standards that corporations and corporate media outlets are now foisting on society and forcing us all to sort of live with are that we need to treat our politicians and we need to treat our celebrities, our reality stars, our actors to the same standards. They need to be held to the same moral standards, essentially, as politicians, and that you cannot slip up. You can't say something politically questionable. It's like we never would have had, like, love or hate Sean Penn. He's an incredible actor. Sean Penn never would have ever been able to be famous in this climate and to be, sort of to make inroads in Hollywood in this climate ever. And so we're purging everybody from our artistic communities because, they mess up with a Facebook meme. It's crazy. Like, why does a contestant on The Bachelor have to have, sort of this like completely sanitized political philosophy that, and even like moral standards? Why do we expect them to have the same moral standards as basically we hold politicians to? It's outrageous.
It's really troubling. I don't think we hold all politicians to those standards, but I think it's something, it is what you said. It's really problematic. It worries me just because it is so un-American. Whether you care about The Bachelor at all, whether you care about Gina Carano and The Mandalorian at all, we really all need to take a step back and just think about the kind of climate and the kind of culture that that's been created that allows people of that magnitude to be taken out of polite society and basically made an example of for very benign things that they say, and things that really are just like an effort to have a dialogue, an effort to have a conversation. Because ultimately, these people are, they are the icons, they're emblematic of the opinions that average, normal American people hold. These are the meme that Gina Carano shared. Should she have shared it? We can have that debate. I don't think it's smart to share it, but that's the kind of stuff that like all the boomers on Facebook are sharing. I mean, this is stuff that, it's like, it's not some fringe idea. The things that Chris Harrison said, those were very nuanced takes and things that people all around the country believe. And when people like that are taken out for saying things that are actually mainstream, that are actually widely held and deeply believed, and just principles that are inherent to human nature and inherent to, the American way and the liberties that we hold dear, and they're made an example of for them, that should really trouble us, whether we care about Star Wars, whether we care about The Bachelor, or even whether we care about the Hollywood, influencer class. Like, you don't have to be plugged into that for this type of thing to ultimately affect you, because it influences how your neighbors think about the things that you say. It influences how, normal people will be treated on social media. The types of ideas that rise to the top as like, these won't be canceled, but these will. And that's how you drive normal people out of polite society and create a narrative that really is not mainstream, but the one that prevails. Because it's the loudest voices and making an example of Chris Harrison for what he did, making an example of Gina Carano, that is not a picture of who we really are. And it's not a picture of what most Americans actually believe about conversations, about dialogue, about debate, and about how to actually have progress. If we're actually trying to have progress on issues of race in America, whatever degree to which you believe we need to have discussions like that, driving a perspective like Chris Harrison's out of polite society is not the way to do that.
Right. No, you raise a really good point. That's actually one of the things I was going to talk about, was that I was going to say there's two interesting things about this. Well, there's more than two interesting things about this, but the sort of two key takeaways for me is that like this is happening at a time when broadly, I feel like as a society, we've rejected this idea of cancel culture, even if it still lives on in the newsrooms, in coastal newsrooms and coastal boardrooms. And so they're sort of setting the standards and they insist on these standards, even though clearly the rest of the country is sick of it. And the second is like, what is the actual effect of this? Are you actually healing this country? Are you actually helping to sort of heal racial wounds, to heal the wounds of bigotry, and to eliminate bigotry further from society? Are you actually doing that? What the principle of this is what gets lost in these conversations, because for people on the one side of the debate that you and I are on, which most of the country is on, and rightfully so, right? Like, it's not just a strength in numbers thing. Like, this is a matter of like principally, from our perspective, this is outrageous and ridiculous, and we sort of get caught up in throwing these like these exasperated labels at it because it's hard to even dig into the meat. It's so ridiculous, and like all of this is so ridiculous. You couldn't have explained it to a person 5 years ago, and unless they were sort of like following campus culture really closely, they would never have believed that this was going to happen in as you say, mainstream society. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it's like, where is the healing and where is the wrongdoing? So like, show me what was actually, like, Chris Harrison gets lumped in as a bigot and as a racist because he said we needed to extend grace to another person who is probably neither a bigot nor a racist. And now two people are have been like publicly smeared, one of whom has lost his job because there's this notion. And by the way, this again, it sets standards. It's enormously chilling around the country. This does not just, even though the rest of the country sort of rejects these standards because they are on principle to be rejected and they are wrong and they are counterproductive and they do nothing to actually heal the wounds that still exist in this country of bigotry. They make them much worse, as a matter of fact. They inflame tensions. So there's that. But then there's also just like, what is the wrongdoing? Why are these people being put through the ringer? And that does trickle down. It's chilling. Like, other people don't speak up. I'm sure in class. I'm sure in conversations at PTA meetings and conversations at barbecues, et cetera, et cetera. The whole country is just being stifled by the stupid precedent-setting, standard-setting decisions that are coming from C-suites.
Right. It also completely dehumanizes the issue. So, if this is something we need to have a conversation about, but this is how it's happening, all of a sudden, some question about what was acceptable in 2018, what was acceptable in 2021, are these parties, racially insensitive? Are they racist? That question that might be worth having and answering becomes the Chris Harrison controversy. And what side of the Chris Harrison controversy are you on? We completely move away from the actual questions and the actual issues and the nuances of them to it becoming a tribal fight about whether you support Chris Harrison or whether you support the Black Bachelor and the people of color on the Bachelorette. And like, that is not what the controversy is. That is not what the question is, but that's what it boils down to. And that's what it becomes. And by the way, this isn't a controversy that boils down between Republicans and Democrats or between the left and the right. This is something that I think average Americans, normal people, have very nuanced takes on this, and they're completely misrepresented, and it turns into a tribal fight that becomes way more political than it actually is.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it's sort of like, the strange thing is that, I keep saying the strange thing because this whole situation is just like deeply bizarre, and it happened, I think, really quickly. But yeah, like, at the end of the day, what's the point of all of this? What is the accomplishment of all of this? And it's just sort of comes down to the profit-obsessed neoliberals at the head of corporate media outlets. Really, I blame corporate media outlets because they need to stop covering this nonsense, because it's just sort of like, it's an easy sort of what we call an aggregation in the business, right? Like, it makes for an easy aggregation when you can throw 5 to 10 tweets in a news story and say there's a juicy controversy involving alleged racism and Bachelor host Chris Harrison. That's a big story. And because they can drop 10 tweets in, they can gin up an entire controversy. And like, yes, it's the fault of the people in the boardrooms who ultimately act on those media stories. But if the media would just stop giving any credence to the silly complaints of, for the purposes of clicks, if they would just stop giving any significance and covering the stupid non-controversies that bubble up, we'd be in a much better position, because corporations wouldn't be forced to respond to them. They would, be able to sort of have perspective on how representative these conflicts actually are of, let's say, broader public opinion and the sort of genuine principles involved in their decisions, instead of just sort of hyperventilating and panic purging.
Yeah, so I haven't really thought of this before. I'm just thinking it through now. You make a really good point about corporate media and the way that they make a way bigger controversy out of it than it is, because they just throw some tweets into a story. It's interesting to me because I think, you're right. These controversies start at a much higher level. They start, among Twitter blue checks. They start kind of in this weird sphere that's detached from reality. But that becomes, the corporate story. That becomes, this is what's happening, even though it's not really happening down on like the ground level of normal people and what they're tuned into. to. So, it's not happening at the local level, it's happening up here. But then that's what feeds into the media narrative. That's what that's what's presented as mainstream or as, the culture war or whatever it might be. But then those decisions and those controversies trickle all the way back down to the local level, in the sense that, this is the narrative that the media is driving. It's about The Bachelor, for instance. Well, now that's going to color the next season of The Bachelor and how many, people of color are represented on it, or, whatever, however the trajectory of The Bachelor is going to look moving forward as it regards racial issues. And that kind of stuff, will factor into decisions, say, that colleges make. Oh, okay, we can no longer have these antebellum parties. We can't, do things this way, or it will color the way that you view culture kind of at that collegiate level, which then kind of trickles down into what's happening on social media, and even what's happening in lower level curriculum, and these controversies that really only exist over here become part of the overall narrative way back down at the local level, even though no one really wanted to have that controversy. And no one is actually concerned about that kind of at a grassroots level.
Well, and I have no idea what the trajectory of this is over the next couple of years, but we actually don't really know the consequences of this standard setting and of this norm setting coming from the corporate media and from other corporations, because it's how it's impacting Generation Z and people younger than Generation Z, and how it will shape sort of their adult worldviews that matters. Because a lot of us already sort of have, that's not the only thing that matters, but that will be sort of that could turn out to be the most consequential effect of all of this. And we still have no idea really how that's happening, because a lot of the kids who will be affected by this are literally in elementary school right now. And we're getting sort of lectures over the course of the school year, to the extent that they were able to, be schooled this year. They were getting lectures on all of this, and that it really does set norms. For instance, the 1619 curriculum was being taught in public schools around the country. And so, yes, this sorts of things, as people hear them and as impressionable teenagers absorb them, they will affect this world for decades to come in ways that we can't really quite know yet. But I think the most important takeaway, and I sort of keep using that superlative language here, the strangest, the most puzzling, the most important. But I really think the most important thing to understand about all of this is that at the end of the day, it's about money. What happened is that it's about academia and it's about money. What happened is that enough young people started flowing through our higher education system that this progressive or bigot binary, as I call it, that was sort of percolating in academia for decades, and is very radical, sort of on an ideological level. It's very radical, and it was admittedly very radical for years, and still is. You'll probably hear radicals taking credit for radicalizing the mainstream now. But what happened is enough people were funneled through our system of higher education that the progressive or bigot binary hit a point of critical mass in the post-graduation so-called real world. And for financial reasons, that necessitates cancel culture, or what we know as cancel culture, because these sort of corporations are convinced that they need to respond for financial reasons by covering the stories, not ignoring the stories, and by firing people and punishing people and making all of these dramatic changes to the art that they underwrite and the art that they produce and promulgate. And it's really having a serious effect on our culture. And I don't think we really even know how serious that effect is going to be until we see some of these younger generations age.
I agree. I do think in this instance, because you're right, it is also about money. And this takes it full circle back to the question of, was this a smart move by ABC? I think in this instance, ABC overplayed their hand and is a little bit too eager and a little ahead of their time, maybe, because while a bunch of their audience might be, college grads who were part of that progressive or bigot binary, who, are going to cheer this decision. I think there is a chunk of their audience that is suburban moms that are not part of the millennial and Gen Z and following generation that is going to have no part of of this strange controversy that they're not interested in, and all they know is that they miss Chris Harrison. And so we'll see how well those academic and monetary decisions work out for them in this case.
Yeah, two things on that point. There's a lot of, and we'll wrap up here, but two things on that point. There's a lot of conversation in Washington about how Democrats were able to sway a lot of suburban women, particularly college-educated white suburban women, to their side in the Trump era. And it's kind of like they think they permanently have the college-educated suburban women. That's what they think, at least, but that's not necessarily true. Actually, I did an interview with an operative who ran a survey of college-educated suburban women in swing states, and I've heard similar things from different people. But that, like, this cancel culture threat really resonates with them because they worry that it's going to come for their husband. They're worried that it's going to come for their children, X, Y, and Z. You keep going down the line, and so just this sort of like distaste for Donald Trump among suburban college-educated women doesn't necessarily mean that there's a love for the Democratic Party and everything that it stands for. And my second point, based on your final comment, was that I'm hopeful that at some point the market is able to take care of this. But at the same time, I think when you have pumped so many college graduates and they're now at the sort of the highest echelons of corporate America, at some point we have to reckon with the fact that they're true believers. And so market forces might not even, there's two things. Market forces might not even be enough to sway them because they're true believers. And secondly, and they already make, a lot of money. And secondly, they have a totally warped view of the rest of the country. They don't understand that the tweet storms are not representative of the broader country. So that's the optimistic note that I'm going to leave us on.
In the words of Chris Harrison, it is unbelievably alarming.
Oh, man. Well, Kylie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Emily, for talking about The Bachelor, because I know how much you love it.
Yes. Well, Kylie's referring to the fact that I'm pro-Bravo and anti-Bachelor. So pro-Housewife, anti-Bachelor. I think the Real Housewives are significantly more entertaining.
We can agree to disagree.
As we have been doing for years at this point. Well, you've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at the Federalist. As always, we'll be back with more. Stay tuned and be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.